It was July 4th, 1956. The champagne glasses were raised high in the Grand Hall of the American Embassy in Moscow. Ambassador Charles Bolan was hosting the annual Independence Day reception. And among the distinguished guests was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev stood near the center of the room, his round face animated as he raised a toast to President Dwight Eisenhower and the future of peaceful coexistence between their two nations. The air was thick with the careful optimism of diplomacy, the clinking of crystal, and the murmur of polite conversation in Russian and English. But 13 miles above their heads, at an altitude where the sky turns black and the earth curves at the horizon, an American aircraft was slicing through Soviet airspace. It had crossed the border from West Germany less than 3 hours earlier. Its cameras were methodically photographing the most sensitive military installations in the Soviet Union: naval shipyards in Leningrad, bomber bases, missile factories, sites that were supposed to be hidden behind the Iron Curtain, protected by the most sophisticated air defense network in the world. And at that very moment, as Khrushchev proposed his toast to friendship and peace, Soviet radar operators were watching the intruder's track on their screens, helpless to stop it. The smile on Khrushchev's face was genuine that evening, but behind it was rage. He had been informed that morning that an American spy plane was violating Soviet airspace. He had chosen not to reveal his knowledge, not to cause a diplomatic incident at the reception. But the humiliation was acute, and the question that would haunt the Soviet leadership for the next 4 years had already formed in his mind. How is this possible? The aircraft was the Lockheed U-2, and for Nikita Khrushchev, it was not just a violation of Soviet sovereignty. It was an insult. It was proof that for all the Soviet Union's military might, for all its fighter jets and surface-to-air missiles and radar stations, they could not stop a single American airplane from flying wherever it wanted. The laughter would come later, in the halls of the Kremlin, but it was not the laughter of confidence. It was the bitter laughter of men who had been made to look like fools. This humiliation, this absolute inability to defend their own airspace, was one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures of the Cold War. The Soviets knew the plane was there. They tracked it from the moment it entered their territory, but they could not touch it. And for the next 4 years, they would desperately search for a solution to a problem they did not fully understand. The insult was compounded the very next day. On July 5th, another U-2 crossed into Soviet airspace, and this time, it did not just photograph military bases along the periphery. It flew directly over Moscow itself. The pilot was Carmine Vito, one of the original 6 CIA U-2 pilots. He followed a railroad line from Minsk to Moscow, using it as a navigation reference. At 66,000 feet, he could see the city spread out below him, the Kremlin, a tiny red star in the center, the Moscow River, a silvery thread. He photographed the Kaliningrad missile factory on the northern outskirts. He photographed the Khimki rocket engine plant. These were facilities that did not officially exist, that were hidden from Western diplomats and journalists, that were supposed to be secure behind the Iron Curtain. The camera captured them in perfect detail. It flew in a straight line over the beating heart of the Soviet Empire, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Soviet fighter pilots scrambled from 3 separate airfields around Moscow. The air defense network that ringed the capital in concentric circles went to full alert. MiG-15 and MiG-17 interceptors roared into the sky. Ground controllers directed them toward the intruder with increasing desperation. The pilots pushed their aircraft to the limits, climbing as high as their engines would allow, burning fuel at an unsustainable rate, trading everything for altitude. They could see the contrail, a thin white line scratched across the deep blue sky, impossibly high above them. Some pilots reported they could actually see the U-2 itself, a dark speck at the top of the contrail, but it was as unreachable as the moon. Pilots attempted the dynamic ceiling maneuver, diving their MiGs to gain speed and then pulling up sharply, trying to use momentum to reach the U-2's altitude. The aircraft would climb briefly above their normal ceiling, hang in the thin air for a few seconds, completely out of control, and then fall away. The U-2 flew on, serene and untouchable, its camera recording everything. The Soviet air defense system was not weak. It was, in fact, one of the most formidable in the world. The lessons of the Second World War had been brutal and clear. Control of the skies meant survival. Lose the skies, and armies on the ground would be slaughtered by enemy bombers. The Soviet Union had invested billions of rubles into radar networks, fighter aircraft, and anti-aircraft artillery. By 1956, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, known as the PVO, were a massive independent branch of the military. They operated thousands of radar stations across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, forming a network designed to detect any intrusion instantly. Their fighter jets were cutting edge. The MiG-17, introduced in 1952, could reach altitudes of 54,000 feet and speeds, approaching the speed of sound. The newer MiG-19, entering service in 1955, was even faster, breaking the sound barrier in level flight. The Soviet leadership believed their airspace was a fortress. American bomber pilots knew it. During the Korean War, American F-86 Sabre pilots had tangled with Soviet MiG-15s flown by Russian aces, and the battles had been brutal and even. The Soviets were not technologically backward. They had radar, they had jet engines, they had guided missiles under development, and yet the U-2 made a mockery of it all. Appeared on radar screens as clearly as any bomber. There was no stealth technology, no attempt at invisibility. Soviet radar operators could see it. They knew exactly where it was, and they could do absolutely nothing about it. They watched the blip on the screen move slowly across the map, tracking its course with grim precision, radioing its position to fighter bases and anti-aircraft batteries, and every attempt to reach it failed. Khrushchev was not a man who accepted failure gracefully. He was a survivor of Stalin's purges, a politician who had clawed his way to the top through cunning and ruthlessness. And now he was being humiliated by American aircraft flying over his country with impunity. His response was not just anger. It was a mystery that obsessed him. Why could the Americans build a plane that flew so high? Why couldn't Soviet engineers match it? Was it a fundamental gap in technology? Or had they simply overlooked something obvious? He demanded answers. He summoned his military commanders, his aircraft designers, his intelligence chiefs, and the question he asked them was simple and devastating. How do we stop it? The investigation began, immediately, but it was an investigation poisoned by Soviet assumptions. The Soviet Union had built its entire post-war military on the principle of matching Western technology through espionage and rapid development. They had stolen the designs for the atomic bomb from the Manhattan Project, through spies like Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs. They had reverse-engineered the American B-29 bomber to create their own Tupolev Tu-4, copying it so exactly that they even reproduced a patch that had been riveted onto one of the captured bombers. They had studied captured German rocket scientists, like those from Peenemünde, to build their own missiles. They had taken the German swept-wing research and applied it to their MiG fighters. This approach had worked brilliantly. The Soviet Union had gone from a devastated, technologically backward nation in 1945 to a nuclear superpower by 1953. Stalin had ordered the first Soviet atomic bomb to be an exact copy of the American Fat Man design, not because Soviet scientists couldn't design their own, but because copying eliminated uncertainty. Why risk failure with an innovative design when you could guarantee success by duplicating something that already worked? This philosophy had become doctrine. Their method was clear. Let the decadent West spend billions on research and development, then steal the results and build it cheaper and faster. But the U-2 was different. This was not a weapon they could simply copy. Even if they had the complete technical specifications, even if they could build an identical aircraft, it would not solve their problem. The U-2 was not a threat to be matched. It was a capability gap to be closed. The Soviets needed to understand not just the aircraft itself, but the philosophy behind it. They needed to understand why the Americans had chosen to build such a strange, fragile, specialized machine. And this they fundamentally failed to do. To them, the U-2 seemed like a desperate measure, an expensive gamble born from weakness. They could not conceive that it represented a completely different approach to intelligence gathering. Soviet intelligence agencies went into overdrive. The GRU, military intelligence, tasked every asset they had in the West to gather information. The KGB's technical intelligence branch began, collecting every scrap of data they could find. They debriefed diplomats who had seen the U-2 at air shows. They analyzed photographs taken by spies. They intercepted radio communications. They even managed to recover small pieces of a U-2 that had crashed during testing in the United States. The picture that emerged was both clear and baffling. The U-2 was not a complex aircraft. It was, in many ways, absurdly simple. It was essentially a powered glider. Its fuselage was based on the F-104 Starfighter, a sleek, needle-nosed jet designed by Lockheed's legendary engineer, Kelly Johnson. But instead of the short, stubby wings of a fighter, the U-2 had wings that stretched over 100 feet, longer than a B-57 bomber. The wings were so long and fragile that the plane needed small wheels attached to the wingtips during takeoff, wheels that fell away once. The plane was airborne. It had a single engine, the Pratt & Whitney J-57. It had no weapons, no armor, no defensive systems. Its only protection was altitude. The Soviets calculated the numbers. To fly at 70,000 feet, an aircraft needed an extraordinary power-to-weight ratio. The U-2 achieved this through radical weight reduction. Everything non-essential was stripped away. The landing gear was minimal. The pilot sat in a tiny, cramped cockpit wearing a full pressure suit, like an astronaut. The fuel tanks were enormous, giving the plane a range of over 3,000 miles. But the fuel itself was a special low vapor pressure mixture that would not boil away at high altitude. Soviet engineers looked at these specifications and came to several conclusions. All of them were wrong. Their first theory was the altitude ceiling theory. Believed that 70,000 feet was not a permanent advantage. It was a temporary gap. The MiG-19 could reach 57,000 feet. The new MiG-21, still in development, was projected to reach 65,000 feet. They calculated that within 2 years, Soviet interceptors would be able to match the U-2's altitude. This was not entirely wrong, but it missed the point. The U-2's altitude was not just about avoiding fighters. It was about operating at the edge of the atmosphere, where the air was so thin that conventional interception was almost impossible. At 70,000 feet, the margin for error in flying was razor-thin. The plane was constantly on the edge of two disasters: fly too fast, and the wings would tear off from aerodynamic stress; fly too slow, and the plane would stall and tumble from the sky. Soviet pilots, attempting to intercept the U-2, found that their fighters became almost uncontrollable in the thin air of the stratosphere. They developed a desperate tactic called exiting onto a dynamic ceiling. A pilot would dive his fighter to gain speed, then pull up sharply, using momentum to climb higher than the aircraft's normal ceiling. It was a dangerous stunt, requiring perfect timing, and even when it worked, the fighter would hang in the thin air for only a few seconds, out of control, before falling back down. The chance of hitting the U-2 during those few seconds was essentially zero. Their second theory was the vulnerability theory. The Soviets convinced themselves that the U-2, for all its altitude advantage, was fatally fragile. They were right about the fragility, but wrong about what it meant. The U-2 was indeed delicate. Its airframe could not withstand combat maneuvers. A single anti-aircraft shell, a single missile, even heavy turbulence could tear it apart. But this fragility was not a flaw. It was the price of altitude. Every pound saved meant another 1,000 feet of ceiling, another 100 miles of range. The U-2 was a reconnaissance platform, not a fighter. It did not need to survive combat. It only needed to fly so high that combat never occurred. The Soviets kept developing heavier, more robust interceptors, trying to build fighters that could climb high and carry missiles. But every pound of armor, every pound of weapons, every pound of fuel reduced the ceiling. They were trapped in a design philosophy that valued survivability over performance. The Americans had made the opposite choice. Their third theory, the most critical one, was the desperation theory. Soviet intelligence concluded that the U-2 program was a sign of American desperation. They believed the United States was flying these dangerous, expensive missions because they had no other way to gather intelligence. This was partially true, but it revealed a catastrophic misunderstanding. The Soviets saw the U-2 flights as a temporary measure, a stopgap until satellite reconnaissance became available. They believed that once satellites were operational, the flights would stop. They did not understand that the U-2 represented something deeper, a fundamental difference in how the two superpowers approached intelligence gathering. The Soviet Union relied on human agents, on spies embedded in Western governments and military establishments. This was effective, but it was slow, and it was vulnerable to counterintelligence. The Americans had pioneered a different approach: technical intelligence, cameras, radar, electronic eavesdropping. The U-2 was not a desperate gamble. It was the leading edge of a revolution in how intelligence was collected, and the Soviets, with their obsession on human intelligence and their assumptions about American motivations, completely missed this. While Soviet commanders raged and Soviet engineers struggled, a very different kind of work was being done in a nondescript hangar in Burbank, California. This was the Skunk Works, Lockheed's secret development division, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson was a legend in American aviation. He had designed the P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine fighter that had dominated Pacific skies during the Second World War. He had created the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, in just 143 days. He was known for two things: delivering revolutionary aircraft ahead of schedule, and doing it without asking permission from committees or bureaucrats. Johnson was not trying to build a better fighter jet. He was solving a completely different problem. The problem was this: the Soviet Union was a closed society. Its military bases, its missile sites, its nuclear facilities were hidden behind the Iron Curtain. American intelligence was flying blind. During the Second World War, reconnaissance had been relatively straightforward. Fly a fast plane over enemy territory, take photographs, and return. But the Soviets had radars and jet fighters and missiles. Any attempt to overfly Soviet territory with conventional aircraft was suicide. Throughout the early 1950s, American reconnaissance aircraft had tried to probe Soviet defenses. Some of these flights ended in tragedy. In 1952, a Swedish DC-3 signals intelligence aircraft was shot down over the Baltic Sea. All 8 crew members were killed. The Soviets denied any knowledge of the incident for decades. Multiple American aircraft were shot down or forced down along the Soviet periphery. The message was clear: conventional reconnaissance aircraft could not survive. The Americans needed a platform that could penetrate Soviet airspace, photograph strategic targets, and return safely. The only solution was to fly so high that Soviet defenses could not reach it. This was the requirement given to Kelly Johnson in 1953. Build an aircraft that can fly higher than 70,000 feet, carry a high-resolution camera, and have a range of at least 3,000 miles. And do it quickly. Because the Soviet nuclear threat was growing every month, the challenge was immense. In 1953, when the project began, the highest-flying operational aircraft in the world could barely reach 55,000 feet. The English electric Canberra bomber, which the Americans had licensed and designated the B-57, could reach 63,000 feet in a zoom climb, but it could not sustain that altitude. The U-2 would need to fly at 70,000 feet, possibly higher, not for a few seconds, but for hours at a time, carrying a heavy camera payload. At that altitude, the air pressure was less than 1/10 of sea level. The temperature outside was minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. A human being without a pressure suit would lose consciousness in seconds and die within minutes. The blood in a person's veins would literally boil from the low pressure. An aircraft engine, starved of oxygen, would flame out unless specially designed. The wings would need to be enormous to generate lift in the thin air, but also incredibly light to keep the aircraft from being too heavy to reach altitude. Every pound mattered. Johnson calculated that for every pound of weight removed from the aircraft, the operational ceiling would increase by about 6 feet. The margin between success and failure was measured in ounces. It was a problem that most aircraft designers considered unsolvable. The Air Force had solicited proposals from multiple companies. Bell Aircraft proposed the X-16, a more conventional twin-engine design. Martin proposed a modified version of their B-57 bomber. Both proposals were heavier, more complex, and could not reach the required altitude. Kelly Johnson did not consider the problem unsolvable. He considered it interesting, and he had an advantage that the other designers did not have. He was willing to break every rule in the book. The solution was radical simplicity. Johnson stripped away everything that was not absolutely essential. The U-2 would have no ejection seat. The pilot would have to bail out manually. No landing gear beyond the bare minimum. The plane would land on skids. No defensive weapons. No radar. No complex electronics beyond what was needed to navigate and operate the camera. The engine would be a high bypass turbojet, efficient at altitude, but relatively weak at sea level. The wings would be absurdly long, giving the plane a glide ratio more like a sailplane than a jet. The entire airframe would be made of lightweight aluminum, so thin in places that ground crews were warned not to lean on the wings. They might dent them. The result was an aircraft that looked like it had been designed by someone who did not understand aerodynamics. But Kelly Johnson understood aerodynamics perfectly. He had built a machine that could do one thing superbly well: fly high, fly far, and carry a camera. The camera was the second revolution. It was designed by Edwin Land, the inventor of the Polaroid camera, working with James Baker, a master optical designer. The camera system installed in the U-2 could photograph objects on the ground from 70,000 feet, with a resolution of less than 3 feet. This was unheard of in 1955. From 13 miles up, the camera could read the headlines of newspapers on a Moscow street. It could count aircraft at an airfield. It could identify the type of missile on a launch pad. The Soviets had no equivalent technology. Their reconnaissance aircraft used cameras that were good enough for battlefield photography, but useless for strategic intelligence. The Americans had created a system that could see details the Soviets could not even imagine. The third element was fuel. At 70,000 feet, ordinary jet fuel would boil in the tanks from low air pressure. The U-2 needed a special fuel with extremely low vapor pressure. Shell Oil developed it, a mixture designated JP7. It was so stable that it would not even burn at room temperature. You could drop a lit match into a bucket of JP7, and the match would go out. But at high altitude, in the cold, thin air, it remained liquid and flowed smoothly to the engine. The development of JP7 caused a nationwide shortage of Esso's FLIT insecticide in 1955. Because the manufacturing process required the same chemical precursors. The Soviets, reading reports of this fuel shortage, did not understand its significance. They thought it was a curiosity, a minor technical detail. They did not realize it was one of the keys that made sustained high-altitude flight possible. The confrontation that finally answered all the mysteries came on May 1st, 1960. It was May Day, the Soviet Union's most important holiday, a celebration of international workers' solidarity. The streets of Moscow were decorated with red banners. Parades were planned. Military formations would march through Red Square. The skies were clear of commercial air traffic, which was standard practice for the holiday. It was, in retrospect, the worst possible day for an American spy plane to violate Soviet airspace, but it was also, from an intelligence perspective, an ideal day. The CIA wanted photographs of Soviet missile sites, particularly the new ICBM facilities at Baikonur and Plesetsk. The U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in the pre-dawn darkness. The flight plan called for him to cross the entire Soviet Union, photographing targets, along a carefully plotted route, before landing in Norway 9 hours later. It was designated Mission 4154, and it would be the longest and deepest penetration of Soviet airspace ever attempted. Powers climbed smoothly to altitude. The J-57 engine, straining in the thin air, pushed the fragile aircraft up through 60,000 feet, then 65,000, finally leveling off at 70,600 feet. Below him, the Soviet Union spread out like a map, vast and brown and featureless. The Ural Mountains were a wrinkled line of shadow. Rivers gleamed like silver threads. He could see the curvature of the earth at this altitude, the horizon bending away in all directions. The sky above was not blue but black, the airless void of space pressing down. He switched on the camera system. The long focal length lens began its programmed sweeps, automatically photographing the terrain below in overlapping strips. He followed his navigation waypoints with precision. First target, the nuclear facility at Chelyabinsk, 65, one of the Soviet Union's primary plutonium production centers. The camera clicked and whirred. Second target, industrial complexes near Sverdlovsk. Third target, the suspected ICBM assembly facilities. Each photograph was priceless intelligence. Powers flew with the calm professionalism of a man who had done this many times before. This was his 28th operational mission for the CIA. He had flown over the Soviet Union before and returned safely. The altitude was his shield. At 70,000 feet, he was untouchable, and 13 miles below, Soviet radar stations lit up with alerts. The intruder was being tracked from the moment it crossed the border. Every PVO command post in Central Asia and the Urals received the same message. High-altitude target, heading northwest, speed approximately 400 miles per hour, altitude 21,000 meters, scramble interceptors. This was not the first time Soviet air defense forces had tracked a U-2. They had done it dozens of times. The response was practiced, almost routine. But this time, there was an additional element of urgency. It was May Day, the most important political holiday of the Soviet year, and an American spy plane was violating Soviet airspace on the very day when the nation was celebrating its power and unity. The response was massive. MiG-19 fighters scrambled from multiple bases. A newly delivered Su-9 interceptor, unarmed and on a ferry flight, was ordered to attempt a ramming attack. The pilot, Captain Igor Mentyukov, climbed desperately toward the contrail he could see far above him. He came close, closer than any Soviet pilot had ever come to a U-2, but the differences in speed and altitude made interception impossible. He overshot the target and had to break off, low on fuel. Then, the missile batteries opened fire. The S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile, known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline, was the Soviet Union's newest weapon. It had a range of 25 miles and could reach altitudes up to 60,000 feet, but 60,000 feet was not 70,000. The missiles would have to climb beyond their designed ceiling. Battery commanders received the order. Engage the target. Authorization granted. The first salvo was fired by a battery commanded by Major Mikhail Voronov. 3 missiles streaked upward, their solid fuel boosters pushing them toward the stratosphere. The missiles were not precise. They were designed to explode near the target, using shrapnel to tear apart the aircraft. At 70,000 feet, Powers heard a dull thump. The aircraft shuddered. The nose pitched down violently. He fought the controls, but the U-2 was breaking apart. The right wing was damaged. The plane began to spin. Powers tried to activate the camera's self-destruct mechanism, a small explosive charge designed to destroy the film and equipment if the plane was shot down. But he could not reach the switches. The plane was tumbling. He released his seatbelt, pulled the canopy release, and was thrown clear. His parachute opened, automatically. He floated down through the cold air, watching pieces of his aircraft tumble past him. 13 miles below, Soviet soldiers were already moving toward the crash site. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Other SA-2 batteries, not knowing the target had been hit, continued firing. A salvo of missiles locked onto a new radar contact. It was not the U-2. It was a MiG-19, flown by Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov, one of the interceptors, still searching for Powers. The missile struck the MiG directly. Safronov ejected but died of his injuries before reaching the ground. In the command posts, there was confusion. Had they hit the target? Multiple batteries reported firing. Multiple batteries claimed kills. The radar screens still showed contacts. But were they the U-2, or Soviet fighters, or the falling debris? It took over 30 minutes for confirmation to reach Moscow. The intruder had been destroyed. The pilot was alive. He was in custody. Khrushchev's reaction was not triumph. It was relief, mixed with fury, and overshadowed by an acute awareness of the opportunity that had just fallen into his lap. For 4 years, American U-2 aircraft had violated Soviet airspace. For 4 years, Khrushchev had been forced to endure the humiliation. His air force could not stop them. His missiles could not stop them. His radar could see them, but his weapons could not reach them. And now, finally, they had one. Not just the wreckage of the plane, but the pilot, alive and unharmed. This was a political gift beyond measure, but it was also a bitter reminder. It had taken 4 years, and hundreds of missile launches, and countless scrambled fighters, and one dead Soviet pilot, and finally, a stroke of luck, a missile that exploded just close, enough to damage the U-2 without destroying it completely, to bring down a single American spy plane. The statistics of the U-2 program tell the story of Soviet failure. From July 1956 to May 1960, the CIA and United States Air Force flew approximately 24 missions deep into Soviet airspace. Every single mission was detected by Soviet radar. Every single mission triggered massive defensive responses. Hundreds of Soviet fighters scrambled, dozens of missile salvos were fired, and until May 1st, 1960, not one U-2 was brought down by hostile action. The Soviets fired over 100 S-2 missiles at U-2 aircraft during those 4 years. The kill rate was less than 1%. The cost was staggering. The SA-2 program had consumed billions of rubles. The radar network required constant maintenance and upgrades. The Tomster, fighter interceptors, the ground crews, the controllers, the entire defensive infrastructure, all of it had been rendered effectively useless by a single type of American aircraft. But the real cost was not measured in rubles or missiles. It was measured in intelligence. During those 4 years, American cameras photographed virtually every important military installation in the Soviet Union. They mapped the locations of bomber bases, counting not just the number of aircraft but identifying their types. They found that many Soviet bomber regiments were equipped with obsolete Tu-4 bombers, copies of the American B-29, aircraft that would be sitting ducks against modern jet fighters. They photographed ICBM facilities and discovered something shocking. The Soviets had very few operational missiles. The massive missile production facilities that intelligence analysts had feared turned out to be largely empty. The assembly buildings existed, but they were not producing missiles in the quantities Khrushchev had claimed. They photographed nuclear facilities, tracking the production of fissile material and estimating Soviet nuclear stockpiles. They found that while the Soviets had nuclear weapons, they had far fewer than American worst-case estimates. They photographed radar stations and surface-to-air missile sites, creating detailed maps of Soviet air defenses. This intelligence allowed American war planners to develop routes that could exploit gaps in coverage. They photographed transportation networks, railways and roads and bridges, identifying vulnerabilities that could be targeted in the event of war. And what they found was shocking, not because the Soviets were strong, but because they were weaker than anyone had believed. Throughout the late 1950s, American politicians and military leaders had been terrified of the bomber gap and later the missile gap. The Soviets seemed to be outproducing the United States in every category of strategic weapons. Khrushchev had been bluffing. He had publicly claimed that the Soviet Union was producing ICBMs like sausages, that they had hundreds of missiles ready to strike the United States. The U-2 photographs proved this was a lie. The Soviet Union had fewer than 10 operational ICBMs in 1960. Their bomber fleet, while large, was technologically inferior. Their air defenses, for all their cost, had a critical gap. They could not defend against high-altitude reconnaissance. The missile gap, which had terrified American politicians and military planners, which had been a central issue in the 1960 presidential campaign, did not exist. The United States was not falling behind. It was ahead, decisively ahead. The U-2 photographs proved it beyond any doubt. This intelligence was priceless. It allowed the United States to plan its own nuclear forces based on accurate estimates of Soviet capabilities, not on inflated fears. It prevented a massive and unnecessary expansion of American missile production. It saved billions of dollars and potentially prevented a dangerous escalation of the arms race. The shootdown of Francis Gary Powers on May 1, 1960, was not a vindication of Soviet air defenses. It was proof of their limitations. It had taken 4 years of trying. It had required Powers to fly directly over a newly deployed SA-2 site. It had required the missile to detonate at exactly the right moment, close enough to damage the plane but not so close that Powers was killed instantly. And even then, the Soviets had accidentally shot down one of their own fighters in the process. The success was real, but it was also a fluke. If the Americans had continued flying U-2 missions after May 1960, the Soviets might have shot down more of them, but the strategic situation remained unchanged. The Soviets could not reliably defend their airspace against high-altitude reconnaissance. Khrushchev understood this. He was a politician, not a fool. When he revealed to the world that the Soviets had captured Powers alive, when he displayed the wreckage of the U-2 and the recovered camera equipment, he was not celebrating a military victory. He was trying to salvage his political position. The U-2 flights had been a national humiliation. Now, at least, he could claim that Soviet defenses had finally worked. But he also tried to give President Eisenhower a way out. He initially suggested that the flight had been ordered by the CIA without Eisenhower's knowledge. This would allow the Americans to apologize, to blame rogue elements, and to continue the diplomatic thaw that both sides desperately needed. The Paris summit was scheduled for May 16th, just 2 weeks away. Khrushchev wanted that summit to succeed. He wanted arms control agreements. He wanted to reduce tensions. But Eisenhower refused the lifeline. On May 11th, Eisenhower publicly stated that he had personally authorized the U-2 flights. He explained that in the absence of an open, skies agreement, the flights were necessary for national security. He said he would continue them. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The deeper failure was not military or political, it was philosophical. The Soviet Union had built its entire Cold War strategy on the assumption that technology could be copied, that any Western advantage was temporary, and that superior numbers and determination would eventually prevail. This assumption had historical roots. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany, not through technological superiority, but through massive industrial production and willingness to absorb horrific casualties. Stalin's famous question about the Pope, "How many divisions does he have?" reflected this worldview. Numbers mattered. Quantity had a quality all its own. The U-2 proved this assumption was wrong. The Americans had not built a better version of a Soviet reconnaissance plane. They had created something entirely new, a platform designed around a radical concept: fly so high that the enemy cannot reach you. More importantly, they had created an entire system. The aircraft was useless without the camera. The camera was useless without the special film that could work in extreme cold. The film was useless without the processing facilities and photo interpreters who could turn images into actionable intelligence. The whole system was useless without the political will to authorize flights deep into enemy territory, knowing that if one was shot down, it could trigger a war. The Soviets had tried to counter the U-2 by improving their existing systems. They made their fighters climb higher. The MiG-21, when it finally entered service, could reach around 60,000 feet, much better than earlier models, but still not high enough. They increased the range of their missiles. The S-75 Dvina, the SA-2, was a major advance over earlier systems, but it still struggled to reach the altitudes where the U-2 operated. They upgraded their radars, making them more sensitive, better able to track high-altitude targets. But these were incremental improvements. They were making their defensive system better at doing what it already did. The U-2 was not an incremental improvement. It was a paradigm shift, and the Soviets, locked into their doctrinal thinking, could not make the equivalent leap. They kept trying to solve the problem within their existing framework, when the problem required abandoning that framework entirely. The irony was that the Soviet Union had brilliant engineers. They had visionaries like Sergei Korolev, who would put the first satellite and the first man into space. They had the resources and the industrial capacity. What they lacked was the freedom to take risks. Kelly Johnson, working at the Skunk Works, had near total autonomy. He could build a plane that violated every standard military specification. He could strip away safety features. He could ignore conventional wisdom. His only requirement was that the plane had to work. The Soviet system did not allow this kind of radical experimentation. Every design decision had to be approved by committees. Every deviation from doctrine had to be justified to political officers. The result was aircraft that were good, sometimes very good, but never revolutionary. The shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers brought the U-2 program over the Soviet Union to an end, but it did not end American high-altitude reconnaissance. By August 1960, the United States had successfully recovered film from the first CORON, a spy satellite. Satellite reconnaissance was even more impossible to stop than the U-2. The Soviets could not shoot down a satellite. They could barely track them. The Cold War's intelligence revolution had moved beyond aircraft entirely, but the lesson of the U-2 remained. The Soviet Union could match American technology in some areas. They built excellent tanks, reliable rockets, capable submarines, but in the critical field of intelligence gathering, of seeing what the enemy was doing without being stopped, the Americans had achieved a superiority that the Soviets never closed. The U-2 flights revealed not just Soviet military installations, but Soviet limitations. The Paris summit collapsed on May 16, 1960. Khrushchev walked into the opening session and delivered a blistering attack on Eisenhower and the United States. He demanded an apology. He demanded a promise that the flights would never resume. He demanded that those responsible be punished. Eisenhower refused. Khrushchev stormed out. The summit was over before it began. The opportunity for arms control, for reducing Cold War tensions, for moving towards some kind of peaceful coexistence, died in that room. Francis Gary Powers was put on trial in Moscow in August 1960. He was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served less than 2. In February 1962, he was exchanged for Rudolf Abel, a Soviet spy who had been caught in the United States. The exchange took place on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, a location that would become famous for such swaps. Powers returned to the United States a controversial figure. Some called him a hero. Others suggested he should have used the poison needle he had been given to avoid capture. He was extensively debriefed by the CIA, and they concluded he had done everything correctly. He had tried to destroy the camera. He had bailed out when the plane became uncontrollable. He had resisted interrogation as much as possible, but the controversy followed him for the rest of his life. The legacy of the U-2 incident was not just a failed summit or a captured pilot. It was the end of an illusion. For the Soviet leadership, it was the end of the illusion that their airspace was secure. They had spent billions building defenses, and a single American plane had made a mockery of them. For 4 years, it had flown overhead, photographing their secrets, and they had been powerless. The shoot-down was a victory, but it was a victory that came far too late. For the Americans, it was the end of the illusion that aerial reconnaissance could continue indefinitely without consequence. The U-2 program had pushed its luck, and that luck had run out. But by the time it ended, the Americans had already gathered the intelligence they needed. They knew the truth about Soviet missile capabilities. They knew the bomber gap was a myth. They knew the missile gap was a myth. They knew that for all of Khrushchev's bluster, the Soviet Union was not 10 feet tall. The question that Khrushchev had asked in 1956, "How is this possible?" had a simple answer. It was possible because the Americans had built a plane designed to do one thing perfectly, and the Soviets, for all their efforts, had been unable to stop it until it was too late. The U-2 incident was a turning point in the Cold War, but not in the way most people remember it. It was not a story of Soviet strength finally overcoming American arrogance. It was a story of a 4-year intelligence failure, a humiliation that ended only by luck and circumstance. The horror that Khrushchev felt, standing in that embassy reception hall in July 1956, unaware that an American plane was overhead, was the horror of a man who, too, understood power and understood that his power was being challenged in a way he could not answer. The U-2 flew untouched over Moscow, and there was nothing he could do about it. That was the real story, not the shoot-down in 1960, but the 4 years before it, when American cameras saw everything, and Soviet defenses saw nothing but their own helplessness.